Hello, class, and welcome back. Today we are going to look at the civil rights and the nonviolent movement and how it is that African Americans fought for equality. As discussed in the last module, the Brown versus Board of Education and the Little Rock Nine catapulted the civil rights movement forward. These two events caused African Americans to have hope that they could accomplish equality. They understood that it was going to be a long battle, but they believed that it would be something that they could accomplish. So today we're going to look at some of those ways in which they accomplished those. So what did they do to get equal rights? Civil rights workers used several direct nonviolent methods to confront discrimination and racism in the late 1950s and also in the early 1960s. They wanted to practice this nonviolent with the idea that that would be how they could show the world that they were equal to whites. They used things like boycotts, sit-ins, and freedom rides. We'll look a little bit closer at those in just a moment. The nonviolent tactics that they used came from Mohandas Gandhi, who used nonviolent to get methods to get independence from England over in India. So we knew that the nonviolence methods could actually work in getting people to believe in equality. American civil rights leaders such as James Farmer of CORE, Martin Luther King Jr. of the SCLC, and others shared Gandhi's views. We also have James Lawson, who was an African American minister that would conduct workshops on nonviolent methods. This was extremely important because African Americans and whites who were going to fight for the civil rights were going to face harassment in various forms, some just words, others more violent. So students needed to, the African Americans and whites needed to know how to deal with that so that public opinion would be swayed towards them versus as the victims versus the aggressor. One of the strategies of the nonviolent movement are sit-ins. The first sit-in took place when four college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, decided that they wanted to desegregate the Woolworth's lunch counter. African Americans were able to shop in the Woolworth and buy from the cashiers just like anybody else. However, when they went into the lunch counter to the cafeteria area, they were denied service except in a specific place for them. They did not like this. They felt that their money was good enough for the shop. It should therefore be good enough for the restaurant. And so the four of them, as well as other African Americans and whites in the college, agreed to stage a sit-in. The protesters would fill the seats at the lunch counter. There were about 64, 65 seats, and all of those would be filled. And their idea was that this was going to take multiple days. Once they were seated, like I said at first, most people kind of just looked at them and made comments to them. Violence was going to eventually erupt after a couple of days. Police were called in. The protesters who refused to get up and leave the store would be arrested. As soon as they were arrested, a new group of protesters would come in and take those lunch counter seats. For multiple days, the lunch counter seats were taken by African Americans and whites who were protesting the segregation of Woolworth's lunch counter. Keep in mind that, like I said, these young men and young women who were protesting were going to be harassed. Some were literally just words, others were spit on, beaten, they had food or drinks poured on them. One person actually had hot coffee thrown in their face. Ketchup, mustard would be dumped on them as well. So all types of ways of trying to get them to get out of the restaurant. The sit-ins became such a useful method, and they found this to be very helpful in getting the lunch counter desegregated, that the sit-ins became a tactic that was used throughout the civil rights movement. Another tactic that was used in the nonviolent method were called freedom rides. This was in response to the segregation on on transportation, interstate transportation. The Supreme Court in 1960 had passed a decision that said that segregation on interstate travel was illegal. The problem is that just like with the Brown versus Board of Education, African Americans were still denied those rights, regardless of what the Supreme Court said. Whites were not going to go down without a fight. In order to push the issue to end the segregation and enforce the Supreme Court decision, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, sent groups on the buses, they were called Freedom Riders, through the southern states. In the process of going through the southern states, they were, at some of the stops, they were just harassed, just like with the sit-ins. However, it got really ugly as angry mobs ended up firebombing the bus, catching it on fire, and as the passengers were coming out, attacking them with baseball bats, pipes, etc., and then arresting them. Other strategies include boycotts. One of the more famous boycott was the Montgomery bus boycott. A boycott in general is just stopping and refusing to buy services or use the services of a business in order for them to change their policies. The Montgomery bus boycott happened because Rosa Parks was arrested after refusing to give up her seat on the bus to a white passenger. With that, the Montgomery Improvement Association organized a citywide protest of these segregated buses. The boycott lasted for a year. During that time, African Americans would not ride the bus. This needs to be kind of put into context. Most African Americans were not going to have cars and relied heavily on the bus to get to their jobs. In order to boycott the bus, African Americans would either have to carpool or they had to walk or bike to their destination. African Americans were true to this boycott and did just that, regardless of the sacrifices that caused in their lives. This was something that they believed in strongly. Eventually, after the year, it did lead to the integration of the buses after a federal court ordered them to desegregate. Martin Luther King Jr. becomes a national figure from the Montgomery bus boycott and also became the president of the newly formed Southern Christian Leadership Council, or the SCLC. Marches and demonstrations was another big way that African Americans fought for equality. Basically, a march or a demonstration is a gathering of multitudes of people in order to gain attention for your cause. So imagine a giant protest rally. One of the most famous marches was on Washington. This was for jobs and equality. In all, over 200,000 people marched on Washington, D.C. to bring attention to the segregation and inequality of the African American. They also wanted to bring attention to the discrimination that was faced by African Americans in jobs. At the March on Washington, this is where Martin Luther King Jr. gives his famous I Have a Dream speech, talking about how one day this country will be united, African American and white, and that we will not judge each other by the color of our skin. The March on Washington gained huge media attention to the civil rights movement, and the impact will be greatly seen. One last strategy that was used was the voter registration, also known as the Freedom Summer. If you recall, after the Civil War, the 15th Amendment gave all persons the right to vote. However, southern states passed literacy test laws and poll taxes or grandfather clauses in order to prevent African Americans from voting. This was a huge problem for the African Americans. They wanted to be able to have a say in their government and continue to fight for the right to vote. In June of 1963, Medgar Evers, who worked for the NAACP in Mississippi, was shot and killed in front of his home. He was a huge advocate for getting African Americans the right to register and had attempted to register multiple African Americans. In 1964, the SNCC workers organized the Mississippi Summer Project to register African Americans to vote in the state. This was an answer to the assassination of Medgar Evers. Again, they wanted to raise attention from the country on what was happening in southern states dealing with racism. The SNCC recruited Northern college students, teachers, artists, and clergy to work on the project. They believed that the participation of these people would make the country concerned about discrimination and violence in Mississippi. If it's not just African Americans, that tends to help. If people are seeing African Americans and whites being attacked, that also raises sympathy for the cause. The project did receive national attention after 3 participants, 2 of whom were white, disappeared in June and were later found murdered in Mississippi. A movie recently, well, not recently, has come out about this called Mississippi Burning. If you would like to see kind of the backstory of those 3 young men. In all, the nonviolent movement did allow for African Americans to get equality. It was a slow, long process, and we'll be looking at um, some of the ways in which they did that, a little bit more details on some of the events that took place during the civil rights movement. As we continue, we'll also be looking at leaders and the success of the civil rights movement.